All right, folks, welcome to the Gritty Podcast. I am your host, Brian Call, and today I am joined by my brother, the Gritty Broman. How are you, Brent?
I'm well, thank you.
All right, today's podcast, we're back with Theodore Roosevelt, his son Kermit, and we're back to the River of Doubt. We've been reading, if this is your first time in, we're reading the book, The River of Doubt, Theodore Roosevelt's Darkest Journey, where he and his son and a group of intrepid explorers float the Amazon, a random river in the Amazon called the River of Doubt, to see where it goes. Sounds risky.
Intrepid explorers or like really unfortunate men?
Yeah, either moniker works, really.
I don't think any of the camaradas were like, sign me up.
Yeah.
I don't think a single one.
So we just concluded the last podcast we did. Rondon made an excuse to stay behind to try to. He's the captain of, and he's a Brazilian colonel or something like that, and he is out there helping Theodore Roosevelt chart the river, and they had a crew member who got angry. His name's Julio, and he shot Paixão, one of the other people, because they caught him stealing food.
They caught Julio stealing food.
They caught Julio stealing food. Paixão did, reprimanded him. Julio got angry, walked all the way back down to the water, grabbed a gun, hiked all the way back up to where Paixão was guarding the food, and then shot him point blank in the chest, in the heart. And then he ran off into the woods. He ditched the gun because he's a coward. Theodore Roosevelt would have liked to have strung him up if he could have got a hold of him. Rondon says he needs a trial. And
Theodore's just, I'm justice.
Yeah, totally. And so that's kind of how the last part ended. They did see Julio hanging from a tree, begging to have them take him with them as they floated by. They did say they go back to find him, sent a couple of guys back to
burn time, though.
To find Julio, really to burn time so he could chart the river. Although I think Rondon would have been happy to get Julio and then take him back to the... But Theodore's like, this isn't practical. He shot one of us. Someone has to stand guard over him now. You'd have to treat him as a prisoner. We don't have the resources for that.
And you got to feed him.
All this stuff. Why don't we just shoot him and leave him behind? Or just leave him behind and let him die a sad death. And so they speculate, well, he probably went into where the Indian trails... took him maybe to the Cinta Larga tribes, which that doesn't sound good for him. One way or another, Julio probably died an ignominious death.
He probably got et.
Because they are cannibals. And he was
But they're selective cannibals, Brian. They don't eat just anybody.
They eat their enemies.
Yes.
They just don't eat anyone from their own tribe.
Exactly. I mean, Julio's on the menu. That's all I'm pointing out.
Totally. Oh, this is so real, like intense. Anyway, before we jump into the next chapter, which is called The Cauldron, if you like the show and you like what we do us a favor, go over to Goat Knives. I got one hanging here around my neck. This is a goat knife coming out of the sheath. If you're watching the video, made out of Nitro V steel. I like this solid handle one. They actually came out with some new ones, and they're on their way, and I'm excited to talk about those. You got to just go check out Goat Knives. The steel is a perfect blend of hardness, but also sharpenability, durability. I just really like these neck sheaths, so you can just kind of have it on your person, handy, always ready to go. I was surprised how convenient this was. So use the code GrittyGoat over at Goat Knives and get a discount on your goat knife. They also have the disposable blade ones. Rather than using a Havalon or something like that, use Goat Knife version. Theirs is pretty sweet. It does other things as well. I like the handle, the shape, and there's a new one coming out. Between these two knives, the solid handle one that goes around my neck like this, and the one I use for skin and game, the replaceable blade knife through Goat Knives, I don't really carry any other knives. These are pretty legit. Yep. Me and Lampers have beat the hell out of these, and our friend Travis Nowotny owns Goat Knives. And Travis is a stud hunter. He's and a good businessman, and they support him, a hunter. So check that out. Goat Knives, Gritty Goat. And then Dark Energy chargers. Use the code Gritty over there. Everybody needs one of these Dark Energy chargers. We've used a lot of chargers over the years. I still have my original Dark Energy charger from 2015.
Same.
I don't know that there's one that's better for the backcountry, the durability, the weight, the longevity. It's kind of the perfect blend of everything. You can drop this thing in a creek bottom and it's not going to short out. It's still going to work. I think it goes underwater like 5 feet for hours and it still works. And they've run it over with cars and it still works. And then
you've dropped yours off mountains.
Yeah, we've done everything to them and they're built. And then the one thing about a lot of chargers I've had in the past is they just run dead. They just die over time. They're good for so many charges and then they just quit charging things. But I have Dark Energies that are kind of everyday use that I've used for 4 years now.
We've used these to run the entire podcast equipment
for years. And still have the originals, and they're still going great. So I don't know what they've done, but it's a good product. So use the code Gritty over there. And finally, do us a favor and use the code Gritty at Mountain Ops. Get some supplements. Get some Ignite. The Yeti. I like the Blaze shots. Those are things I recommend. I like Renew with the bowels and keeping the stomach good. That's bold. It's a bold move, Cotton.
Wasn't a full scoop.
Brent just took it straight. For those that are listening, just took a.
It's like a spicy Jolly Rancher.
This one's Citrus Bliss. Now my mouth is watering. I can smell it in the air. But use the code Gritty over there at Mountain Ops. Also, the merino hoodies they have are great. I've been using those for 3 years on all my hunts now, and I wear a merino hoodie. Even in daily wear, I have a black one, but I use the green when I'm out there hunting. Check them out. They got a bunch of great workout gear too. Mm-hmm. Okay, let's get into the podcast here. We have Chapter 27, The Cauldron. Even as they speculated about Julio's fate, the 19 remaining members of the expedition knew that they were not much better off than he was. They had a handful of advantages ranging from weapons to supplies to sheer numbers over the man that they had just abandoned to the jungle.
I push back on that. Did they abandon him to the jungle?
I wouldn't use that.
I wouldn't have phrased that.
They did.
Candace.
They did ditch him as they floated by.
Okay, well,
they could have swung by and grabbed him, and they chose not to.
But I mean, you're on the move. I mean, detours add up. Time is of the essence. He could have swam.
Well, they decided to leave him behind. Maybe that's the term, abandoned. Each of those resources, however, had proved to be far less valuable than they might have imagined before reaching the rainforest. So anyway, they had different supplies and weapons that were good, and some they ended up using. Their rifles, though, which they had assumed they could rely on to supplement their rations, had never fulfilled their promise.
I feel like there's a couple of dead monkeys that would say otherwise.
There's a couple, but yeah. In a rare moment of foresight during the pre-journey planning in New York, Fiala, who was the renowned failed explorer from the Arctic, Fiala had hired a company to pack the expedition's ammunition in zinc cases. Why don't you look up Fiala real quick and get us an update on exactly Fiala Explorer? I can't remember now. I'd like to get an update on who he is, but so he was the guy that was working at the failed explorer that was working at Abercrombie and Fitch when the priest met him, and then he helped plan this whole expedition. So it says. In New York, Fiala had hired a company to pack the expedition's ammunition in zinc cases, 100 rounds to a case, to protect it from the corrosive effects of the jungle's heavy humidity. Even an endless supply of bullets, however, would have done them little good since they could find no game to hunt. The best shot that any of them had taken on the banks of the River of Doubt had been Julio's deadly accurate bead on Paishon, the murder.
So Fiala's the guy that went to the North Pole.
Mm-hmm. So it was the.
So the expedition was called the Baldwin Ziegler Polar Expedition. And he was also the guy that packed all the stuff for him, too. That was his job on the thing. They lost their ship, and they failed to reach the pole entirely. And they were stuck there for almost 2 years before relief came and got them.
So, I mean, the fact that they survived was somewhat of it's kind of legendary. I think they're eating a lot of penguins by the end, if I recall. But still, he was the one who planned it. I could see how you might have a little, like...
I feel like Fiala should have learned his lesson and gone back home to Jersey. Just stay home. Like, you're meant to stay home, bro.
So then he plans the expedition for the River of Doubt. He's kind of a failed explorer. Ends up working at Abercrombie and Fitch, which is like Sportsman's Warehouse.
Fiala wrote a book.
What's it called?
It's called Troop C. In Service. Fighting the Polar Ice. He never got to the pole. That's a little...
I think they got frozen on the ice is what happened or something like that. And I don't recall.
Ship.
Anyway, you guys can look it up.
Let us know in the comments.
There you go. So awkward and heavy were the expedition's dugout canoes that they were only slightly preferable to having no boats at all. Because they had brought those canvas-covered ones that were great for like lightweight packing through the woods, and it was just a fatal error to decide to leave those canoes behind. They didn't want to pack them through the bushes. They're like, we'll just make a canoe when we get there. Not realizing what they were talking about.
Have you ever tried to like ride on a log across a river?
It's unwieldy.
It doesn't work.
So it says that they lost a lot of canoes. They encountered so many rapids that they had only made it 3 miles on that first day. The following day was even worse, allowing the expedition only 15 minutes of quiet water between each set of rapids. The rapids of the River of Doubt had destroyed 6 of their canoes in less than a month. The problem Roosevelt realized was as much as the boats that they were riding in as the river that they were the problem was as much as the boats they were riding in as the problem was the boats as much as it was the river. That's what he's saying. Meaning the river was really bad, but they could have done this a lot better if they had better boats. But they had such crappy boats combined with such crappy river, it was bad. How I longed for a big Maine birch bark, such as that I had once. He just says how much he misses a real boat.
Mattawamkeag.
I know, that's why I didn't read it.
Mattawamkeag.
Which is a river back where Theodore Roosevelt called home.
Oh, the rivers of the Mattawamkeag.
Yeah. As for their provisions, the men were now eating barely enough to stay alive, much less to fuel the hard work that they had to do in order to get through and around the rapids. My supper consisted of 1 soda cracker and a small portion of fish with a cup of coffee, Cherry wrote in his diary.
That's literally what I ate for breakfast today. A little can of sardines. I had like 5 Ritz crackers with it, and then I had some McKnight. Some Mountain Mocha. Check it out.
Not a very hearty meal for a full-grown man, because that's not your only meal today.
It's not my only meal since
you're not
today.
hiking through the jungle. The officers did their best to supplement the Camerata's diet with food from their own ration tins, but they had too little to spare, and the delicacies that Fiala had packed simply stirred the appetites of the rugged paddlers and porters. That's the problem, is they have a whole lot of condiments, but not a lot of food, because Fiala's planning.
Take some ketchup. You can make a little tomato soup.
Cherry suspected that this near-starvation diet was at the root of many of their maladies. The lack of sufficient food is one potent reason why we are all physically below normal, he wrote. Cherry and Lyra had been battling dysentery for weeks, and 2 of the camaradas were so ill that the others feared for their lives. A long further delay, accompanied by wearing labor, would have almost certainly meant that the weakest among our party would have begun to die, Roosevelt wrote. Roosevelt himself was at the top of that list, but his son was not far behind. Although Kermit rarely mentioned his malaria in his journal, Cherry wrote that Kermit's fever was so bad that he was scarce able to stand. Deeply concerned, Dr. Kajazira began to inject quinine directly into Kermit's arms, but his fever continued unabated. Kermit was so sick that he did not even notice when his dog Trigiro leapt out of his dugout just as the paddlers pushed off from the bank. Trujillo had been given to Kermit as a gift early in the expedition and had quickly become his closest companion. Kermit had even written about his dog in his letters to Belle, recounting their long solitary walks across the Chapadeo, and how Trujillo would wish him good night at the end of the day by thrusting his muzzle into his master's hand as it hung over the side of his hammock. Despite Kermit's affection for Trujillo, nothing could be done to retrieve him until the expedition found a place to camp for the night.
Turd dog.
The men had traveled roughly 200 miles by that point, but they still had at least 200 more to go until they reached the fork in the river where they hoped Lieutenant Pyrenees would be waiting for them. Rondon's early decision to send Pyrenees up the Arapawana to meet their expedition with new provisions had proved prescient, and if all went according to plan, could save their lives. So, backing up here, when they headed out on the journey in the beginning, they decided to send someone with a boat up the river as far as they could get it. But they were guessing what river that was. They were like, I think that the River of Doubt flows into this big, huge tributary river and then flows into the ocean. So
they don't know.
But they don't know. And so they're kind of guessing, and they're saying, they're going to send this Lieutenant Pyrenees up the river, and they're hoping that they're going to run into him on their way out. That's their prayer. So after all that had happened to them, however, they could not feel confident that if they did make it to the agreed-upon rendezvous point, Pyrenees and his party would be there waiting for them. It's been a while. The Brazilian lieutenant faced a difficult voyage of his own, and there were no guarantees that he and his men had reached their destination.
Woof.
The possibility that they might not return home alive, once a remote and abstract idea, had become a corrosive, everyday burden for the members of the expedition. In this is, when we go out and we go hunting, and they're talking about nutrition here. It used to be, I remember bringing like a bunch of Snickers bars, Milky Ways, me and Ben, and we would bring cousin Ben, and we'd bring like garbage food, and we'd get those, back in the day, we would pack all those bars.
Cliff Bars?
Cliff Bars, which tasted like bark.
They're like a dog biscuit.
We'd pack those Cliff Bars and Power Bars and some of that stuff for energy. And then I remember we'd bring ramen, a lot of top ramen and stuff because it's lightweight. But day after day on long excursions, hunt after hunt, we would fall apart physically. So much of that was how we packed. Our nutrition, we had calories, but we didn't have nutrition. And when you're young, you can get away with some of that, but it causes a lot of inflammation. I was really sore on hunts in my 20s that I'm never sore on now, and I'm way harder. What seemed so difficult, I remember us hiking in like 2.8 miles and thinking that was so far and so difficult, and setting up our tents and hunting for elk. And I remember coming back from those trips and being all swollen and sore, and we killed some bulls with bows and packed them out, and it was just so grueling. I look back on that and it was child's play. I mean, it was really, really pretty minor stuff what we were doing. And I don't know, so much of that is a change in know-how, experience, knowledge. They're talking about on this trip how weak they all are. And they've been out there a month in the Amazon. If they had solid nutrition, even medicine on this trip, and they were much more prepared for all of this stuff, if they had the real boats, imagine a pack raft, and you have a bunch of them and even spares, it's like you could with technology and know-how and the right nutrition and all of that. I mean, it's a drastically different world. It sort of reminds me of when you read like another great book is Blood and Thunder. Talks kind of about the West being one, and it has it really does follow the story a lot of Kit Carson and early mountain man, and Western, and even I think a scout soldier. But when you read about those stories, they're out there in the wilderness. They're out there where the native people already live there. And they're thriving, they're eating well, they're super healthy, they're physical specimens. And then you have your explorer crew, sort of like Meriwether Lewis and stuff, and on Lewis and Clark expedition, and how they're starving to death where other people are not, because they know the jungle, like they know the desert, they know the place. That kind of woodsmanship and knowledge on how to survive and live outdoors and all that could make the outdoors seem so simple if you know things, and so deadly if you don't. Am I making sense?
Mm-hmm. It's kind of hard because there's no way for any of these guys to be familiar with the Amazon.
The Cajazeras more so, and Rondon more so. They're definitely familiar. I mean, they know somewhat about. They need Brazil nuts. They need this. They need that. Catching a fish. I mean, they were able to catch some giant catfish, some other fish, some piranhas. They were able to get a thing here and there. Mm-hmm. But imagine if they were skilled at all of that. They wouldn't be in the predicament they're in.
Yeah, because there's people living out there. There are people that are more familiar with it.
Absolutely. Anyway, it says, back to the book, it says, despite, so they leave the dog.
I think we're at
the
journey. So
they're starting to feel like they may not make it. It says that as the journey wore on, the Amazonian jungle, which had never seemed welcoming, had begun to feel not just dark and dangerous, but inescapably oppressive. It was a sensation that most outsiders who plunged into that dense, inscrutable wilderness experienced, and it left behind an indelible, almost violent impression. The Polish explorer and writer Arkady Fielder wrote that after he and his companions had spent months in the Amazon rainforest, something began to go wrong in us. Coming daily into such close contact with the virgin forest we found, as so many other white men had found before us, that its grotesque forms and brilliant colors got on our nerves like a nightmare. It was stifling us. The whole exotic jungle became one gigantic cauldron of hatred and brutality.
That's not one gigantic cauldron of hatred and brutality.
For outsiders who are forced to spend lengthy periods in the rainforest, one of the most oppressive and frequently mentioned features is its relentless monotony. Although their boats were passing through a world of infinite variety, to the members of the expedition, everything had begun to look simply green. Definitely. I've been in places where everything looks the same. I was just talking about hiking out with that grizzly bear out of the Alaskan bush, and once we got off trail and just bushwhacked, everything looked the same. Every little moose trail, every little corner, every little bush. I mean, you could hike, 5 miles, and it just looks, you're in circles. And if you don't have a direction, you don't have a compass, a map, something to keep you on track, you're just going in circles. Like, you wouldn't know everything. There's no landmarks to go off of. The creatures of the Amazon had become such masters of disguise that all the men could see on either side of the river was verdant leaves and heavy vines. An Englishman who had traveled along 2,000 miles of Amazon River just a few years before, Roosevelt did, tried to explain his overwhelming sense of sameness by comparing the rainforest to the soaring sky and the endless sea. The forest of the Amazons is not merely trees and shrubs. It is not land. It is an other element, he wrote. Its inhabitants are arborean. They have been fashioned for life in that medium as fishes to the sea and birds to the air. Its green apparition is persistent as the sky is and the ocean. In months of travel, it is the horizon which the traveler cannot reach. The camaradas were deeply affected by the forest's stifling monotony, the river's myriad dangers, and their own dark fears, and the American officers charted their emotional decline with growing alarm. Cherry discovered that a box of shells for his rifle had been stolen by some of the camaradas who, he wrote in his diary, doubtless thought the cans contained meat. As the expedition already had little ammunition to spare, the theft was a serious one. My gun is thus rendered of little value for obtaining meat for our party, Cherry wrote. Even more damaging than the loss of the shells was the blow to the trust between the officers and the camaradas. No one could blame Julio this time. Rondon was willing to admit that physically his men were worn thin, but he continued to insist that mentally and emotionally they were as strong as ever. It says the rainforest did not depress Rondon because it was the only home he knew, more familiar to him even than his own wife and children. For the fever-racked Roosevelt, however, it was nothing of the kind. Rather, the expedition was becoming an ordeal of inhuman proportions, testing his strength and resolve as nothing he had encountered in a lifetime of self-imposed physical challenges. When he wasn't too sick to sit up, Roosevelt sought comfort and distraction in the world he knew best, his library. For his trip to Africa, he had spent months choosing the books that he would take with him, ordering special volumes that had been beautifully bound in pigskin, with type reduced to the smallest legible size so that the books would be as light as possible. Look at that. His backcountry hunting, he's got to bring his book, so
it's got to be a backcountry
he's got a,
lightweight
miniature book. Word so he could get it as small as possible. It says that Roosevelt, Kermit read so rapidly that he had to plan very carefully in order to have enough books to last him through a trip. Yeah, Caitlin reads books instantaneously, my daughter. She's 18. She can look at a page and she's like, nyeh, nyeh. She'll read this whole book in maybe one day and then retain it.
I can read fast, but I can't retain it.
She's a freak. There's people with that gift, you know. He had not had the luxury when preparing for his South American journey, however. The plans for the Brazilian expedition came into being so unexpectedly that he could not choose his library with usual care. So it sounds like Thomas More's Utopia, the plays of Sophocles, the last two volumes of Edward Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, and Marcus Aurelius and Epictetus. These and many others comforted me much, Roosevelt wrote, as I read them in headnet and gauntlets sitting on a log.
So it wouldn't get eaten alive?
That's interesting. I've read a lot of Marcus Aurelius.
Mm-hmm.
And
it's the only one I recognize.
I have not read Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. It looks like Theodore was on the Roman Empire kick here. Thomas More's Utopia and the plays of Sophocles, which is Greek, right? Mm-hmm. So, but by this point in the expedition, Roosevelt had already read and discarded every book in his small traveling library and was desperate for new reading material. He finally resorted to reading Kermit's Oxford Book of English Verse, even though he was unimpressed by it. That's when you know you're desperate, when you're reading stuff you don't even like. The choice from Longfellow's poems appealed to him as particularly poor, Kermit recalled, and I think that it was for this reason that he disapproved of the whole collection. After tearing through the book of English verse as he lay burning with fever, Roosevelt turned with great reluctance to the book of French verse, which he considered to be better than nothing, but just barely. For French verse, Father had never cared. He said it didn't sing sufficiently. The Song of Roland was the one exception he granted, Kermit wrote. It was therefore a still greater proof of distress when he borrowed the Oxford Book of French verse. Roosevelt read the book, but he complained so bitterly about it that his Francophile son finally threatened to take it away if he did not stop attacking his favorite works.
That's awesome.
That's funny. That's funny how much Kermit liked it and Theodore hated it, you know, and yet they both have so much in common still too, you know. Kermit too found in his few remaining books some measure of escape. I just want to talk about this briefly before we move on, though. Look at the books that Kermit is reading as a young man. Look at the books that Theodore Roosevelt is reading, and look at the books today that modern people read, if they read at all.
What's wrong with Harry Potter, Bri?
Well, I think Harry Potter is genius, actually. That's why it's sold billions of books and is one of those. I think the rewrites of Harry Potter and the all the extraneous interpretation of the book later and changing the characters and things is stupid. But I think the book itself is pretty genius. That's why it was successful. It has archetypal themes that every human being understands. It's a hero myth, and we all get that. But what I'm saying is most people that I know today, they aren't reading classical works. They're not studying Marcus Aurelius. They're not reading the books of philosophers. They're reading Ibram X. Kendi and the 1619 Project and White Fragility and all of this sort of woke neo, Marxist garbage, as well as just consuming social media and pretty much weak rap, as their their wisdom of choice, their place to get knowledge. All I'm saying is that you can see how at this time in the world there's an effort to read some of the greatest minds that ever lived, thousand-year-old writings, 500-year-old writings that have lived through the ages, and that is not necessarily what's going on in today's education system and what's being pushed and talked about in today's world. I think there needs to be a renaissance of all of that.
I think there is.
Hopefully. My kids are homeschooled, so now they're reading Marcus Aurelius instead of some woke garbage at school. All right. So getting back to the book, let's see. He says, we're going to skip ahead here.
Come up here.
More effective than books for Kermit, although in even shorter supply, was a bottle of scotch that he and Cherry shared when, in Cherry's words, they felt the need of spiritual help. The two men had actually started out with 3 bottles, but since they had taken quite generous drinks, the first bottle had quickly disappeared. They were more conservative with the second bottle, but soon it too was gone. With only 1 bottle left and a seemingly endless river before them, Kermit and Cherry treated the whiskey they had left with great care. When we got the 3rd bottle out on the first night, Cherry would later recall, we held it up and took a pencil and marked off, this is the 10th, the 11th, the 12th, the 13th, 14th, 15th, marked off the amount we could take from that bottle. You can imagine the marks were closer and closer together on the bottle.
Yeah. I mean, do I want to be in the rainforest without some liquor? Probably not. Sounds like hell.
It's funny, and for Kermit throughout his life, alcohol turned out to be, a major problem. But I think that had more to do with his melancholy and his predispositions, maybe in temperament and such. I don't know, physiology. Like Kermit with his books, Cherry enjoyed his whiskey, but found little relaxation in it. With each passing day, the naturalist grew increasingly worried about the expedition, and he bristled at every decision that seemed to him to endanger it further. So he goes off. He's pissed off at Rondon. They take forever. He thinks that Colonel Roosevelt and that they need to get out of there. His disapproval only deepened as the day wore on and the men did not return. Finally, at almost 5 p.m., the camaradas stepped into camp with Trigueiro at their side.
So good, they found him.
They went and got the dog. An entire day had been lost to searching for Kermit's pet. But Rondon is looking for any excuse to stay out there longer. Obviously, Rondon isn't worried for his life at all.
At all. The man has no self-preservation, ready to die at the drop of a hat.
I just think he's not suffering much. This is his whole life. Like I said, he's sort of the native that's grown up there. He's
used to it.
He's used to the austerity. His body is well adapted to it. He doesn't have dysentery.
Yeah.
He doesn't have these problems.
I went powerlifting with a buddy the other day, and it's his first time ever doing any kind of deadlifts or anything like that. I did it, and I did a lot less weight this time around so he could do it. I was totally fine. I was wanting to go back and work out more, but didn't have enough time. He was broken the next day.
Yeah. Yeah. So Cherry's pissed off. It says, by the end of the day, however, the delay had also yielded a piece of exceptionally good news. While waiting for the two searchers to return with Trigueiro, Luis Correa had taken one of the dugout canoes and gone fishing along the opposite side of the river from the expedition's campsite. As he worked his way along the shore, Cherry wrote excitedly, he found a place where a bajuca, B-E-J-U-C-A, bajuca, had been cut off with a knife or an axe. Not only did the use of a metal tool indicate that a rubber tapper rather than an Indian had cut the vine, but it was obvious to Correa that whoever had done the cutting had been sitting or standing in a canoe rather than on the riverbank. Having gone this long without seeing anyone else on the river, the members of the expedition knew that the Indians who lived along its banks were not, as Cherry put it, canoe Indians, making it all but certain that rubber tappers had reached this far up the river in boats. This was the first mark of the outside world that the men had seen since they had launched their dugouts on the River of Doubt a month and a half earlier. It was a sign of hope, a sign that salvation lay within reach.
So a bajuca is a snake.
Oh, really?
Yeah. I was thinking fish this whole time. So that makes more sense because they saw that it was cut through with an axe, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, he found a place where a bajuca had been cut off.
It's got a really long face. Let me turn that brightness up.
I thought that it was a vine, but then...
The snake looks like a freaking vine.
It does. That's weird looking.
Yeah, it has little tiny teeth.
That looks like a vine. That doesn't even look like a snake.
Yeah.
Looks like a vine with a mouth. And that mouth looks weird.
Yeah. It's really long and pointed.
It looks like it's like meant to look like a stick.
It's
like a vine. I mean, it's mimicry for sure. All right.
Bajuca.
Yeah, weird, huh? Okay, here we go. If the discovery of a knife-cut vine... So they're saying it's a knife-cut vine.
Okay.
But in here, when you Google it...
It pops up with a vine snake.
If the discovery of a knife-cut vine offered the men the first tangible sign that they might yet emerge from the rainforest alive, it did not provide any immediate relief. On the contrary, it raised the possibility of a new danger associated with the region they were approaching, a no-man's land between unmappable jungle and the Amazon's rough pioneer civilization. The penetration of outside pioneers into the Amazon had been far from organized or peaceful. The trappers who had reached this far up the River of Doubt were likely alone, afraid, and in dangerous straits themselves. In approaching their huts from upriver, moreover, the members of the expedition were crossing the frontier from the wrong direction. Right? Like if they see someone floating down the river, it's like, whoa, wait a minute. Everybody that's new is pretty much coming from the other side of the river. The only humans the settlers expected to see coming from the river's headwaters were hostile Indians, and they would do whatever they felt was necessary to defend themselves. It would suck to get shot now by trappers on the way down.
I'd be pissed.
So the Seringueiros were, by default, the true settlers of Brazil's interior. When Henry Ford had introduced the Model T in 1908, the Amazon had been the world's sole source of rubber. The wild popularity of these automobiles and the seemingly insatiable demand for rubber that accompanied them had ignited a frenzy in South America that rivaled the California gold rush. In The Sea and the Jungle, H.M. Tomlinson complained that the only thing Brazilians saw in their rich rainforests in 1910 was rubber. It is blasphemous that in such a potentially opulent land, the juice of one of its wild trees should be dwelt upon as though it were the sole act of providence, he wrote. The passengers on the river boats are rubbermen and the cargoes are rubber. All the talk is of rubber. Rubber's important.
I was going to say, what's he hating on rubber for?
2
Pretty
years,
dope.
2 years before Roosevelt had, the rubber today is not the same as then, but 2 years before Roosevelt had set sail for South America, his friend, the great American naturalist John Muir, had been similarly astonished by the rubber lust that he had witnessed. He says that, He marveled, half crazy, half merry, daring fevers, debilitating heat, and dangers of every sort. These are what these men. It was a rubber rush instead of a oil or gold rush.
I can't say rubber rush without.
Yeah.
I've definitely rushed for a rubber.
But by the time Roosevelt reached the Amazon, the dangers were still there, but the promise of riches had all but disappeared. So the bottom had dropped out of the rubber market in 1912 when the Amazon lost its lock on the market. Because 36 years earlier, an Englishman named Harry Wickman had smuggled the plant out of Brazil. Those seeds had been cultivated at Kew Gardens, and the British had eventually planted their predecessors in tropical Malaysia. So they basically took it from the Amazon all the way to the other part of the world, to Malaysia. And there, far from their natural enemies, the trees could be planted in neat rows with no fear that a blight could destroy the entire crop. Like it did in South America, labor in Malaysia was also cheap. So successful had been the transfer of rubber trees to the Far East that by 1913, Malaya and Ceylon were producing as much rubber as the Amazon without getting killed by Indians.
Awesome. I take that route.
Because of the cost and time-consuming experimentation and the difficulty of finding reliable labor, very little effort had been made to even try to cultivate the tree in South America. It just wasn't a very good place to try to grow it. Brazilian tappers, therefore, had to live where the trees did. In order to find untapped trees and claim a small slice of land as their own, they had to keep moving deeper and deeper into unexplored territory. By the time Roosevelt's expedition descended the River of Doubt, these early settlers had become the point of intersection between the Amazonian wilderness and the outside world. You can just imagine what type of dude you're going to find.
Oh, bro. Like, just some hillbilly kind of like hick guy playing a banjo. That's the feel I'm going to get.
Not only was it a difficult, lonely life, but it was an almost impossible job. A man could do little more than clear a pocket of land just large enough to hold his own small hut and a subsistence garden. The death rate was dismally high. Many of the dangers that the members of the expedition had faced since setting off of their on their river journey were part of the settlers' daily existence. Not surprisingly, the life of the settler appealed to only the most desperate of men. Such a man, Roosevelt wrote, the real pioneer, must have no strong desire for social life and no need, probably no knowledge of any luxury or of any social comfort save of the most elementary kind. He must also be willing to spend most of every day alone in the jungle. So the rubber tapper's day started before the sun rose, when he stumbled through the black forest carrying a curved knife and wearing that kind of headlamp that miners rely on as they descend into the bowels of the earth. As the tapper pushed through the dense vegetation, he could see only a few feet in front of him. Everything beyond, beside, or behind the arc of his headlamp was cloaked in absolute darkness. Even in the full light of day, the trails that had been blazed to his rubber trees were difficult to discern. In the pre-dawn hours, with nothing but the thin, trembling light of his headlamp to illuminate the forest, they were all but invisible, as were the dangers that waited on branches, under fallen logs, and in the very air.
You're not going to pay me enough to go through the Amazon with a ghetto-ass headlamp like that. There's just no way.
With all the snakes and poisonous everything. And
yeah.
Ants and
I don't even
insects.
like walking in the dark with a headlamp on, let alone through the rainforest.
By 10 a.m., a typical tapper had visited between 150 and 180 trees, attaching small zinc bowls to the trees to capture the latex as it oozed out of the incision. He then had to retrace his steps in the afternoon, making his way through the steaming jungle to each tree so that he could collect the latex. When he returned home in the evening, more hot and miserable work awaited him. Hunched over a heavy, oily smoke that rolled from a palm nut fire, he poured the latex onto a rough wooden spit, that he turned over and over until it slowly coagulated in thin, even layers. It could take weeks of this relentless work to produce a single ball of rubber that was heavy enough, between 60 and 150 pounds, to be sold. Who packed that thing out?
Not me. Screw that noise.
You floated out. As difficult for the tappers as their hand-scrabble existence was, the knowledge that what little they had managed to build could be taken away from them at any moment's notice was that knowledge. They could be taken away. They did not have anything other than squatters' rights. And they were vulnerable to threat of wealthier, savvier men sweeping into their territory and buying it. The tappers themselves, of course, thought nothing of taking land from the Indians who had lived on it for millennia. Besides Rondon, few Brazilians at the time believed that the Amazonian Indians had any rights at all, certainly not to something as valuable as land. The men's jubilation at discovering the cut vine turned into tense anticipation. They start making their way down the river. It says that after launching their boats that morning and traveling for 2.5 hours, the men spotted a rough plank affixed to a stake on the left bank of a river. Dizzy with excitement, they quickly pulled the dugouts over to investigate. They soon discovered that there were actually 2 markers, one on each side of the river, and burned into them both were the initials J.A.
J.A. What's the name of the guy they're waiting for?
Lieutenant Pyrenees. An hour later, they saw a house.
A house?
Mm-hmm. It was a very simple house made of palm thatch with a smaller hut next to it for rubber smoking. But there was no confusing it with the Indians' huts that they had seen upriver. It was, in the eyes of the men, a herald of the outside world. Shouts of exultation went up from our canoes as this frail outpost of civilization met our eyes, Cherry wrote. Can you imagine that feeling? 6 weeks?
Bro, I'd be hesitant. There's like going to be some serial killer or something in there, dude. That would be my luck.
Okay, the house belonged to a tapper named Joaquim Antonio.
Joaquim. J.A.
The tapper whose markers they had seen on the riverbank and the belongings inside indicated that he had a wife and child.
That lady's got balls.
It's a different world for some people.
Bro.
Much to the dismay of the members of the expedition, however, the house was deserted. Not only were the men eager to meet a rubber tapper, but the sight of food stored inside was excruciating because without Antonio's permission, Rondon would not let them take even a single yam. So none of the provisions were touched, Cherry wrote, although we were sadly in need of some things for our camaradas. Little more than a mile downstream, a single small canoe appeared in front of them, carried along by the swift current like a fallen tree branch. The sight sent a rush of excitement through the 4 dugout flotilla, but it was not excitement that burned in the chest of the tapper in the canoe. Looking up to find a line of dugout canoes coming toward him from the direction of the river's mysterious headwaters, Raimundo Jose Marquis, an old black man who lived alone on the banks of the River of Doubt, turned his boat and paddled quickly toward the shore. Wouldn't you?
Yeah.
It's not the 4-legged predators we're afraid of.
Yep.
When Rondon saw Marquis, he jumped out of his seat, snatched the cap off his head, and began waving it like a flag, shouting to the tapper that there was nothing to fear. They were not Indians. Fortunately for the expedition, Marquis did not disappear into the jungle as soon as he reached the bank. Instead, he stood at the river's edge and listened to Rondon. After a few minutes, he climbed back into his canoe and slowly paddled over to the strange group. Upon reaching them, he tried to explain to Rondon the terror that had driven him ashore. It was quite impossible for him to expect the arrival of civilized people descending the river from its source, Rondon later wrote. Marquis' description of the members of the expedition as civilized people only underscored how far the men still were from a settled area. To anyone who had not spent years in the wilderness, the men would have looked almost inhuman. After weeks of surviving on little more than a few bites of fish and a single biscuit each night, they were gaunt and hollow-cheeked. The clothes on their backs, the only clothing they had left, were in tatters, and wherever their skin appeared, it was bruised or cut, sunburned, and peppered with insect bites. They were filthy and wild-eyed from disease and fear, and their American commander was barely clinging to life. Yeah. Did that surprise you, Brent?
Clothes are weird out in the wilderness. Like, I just can't imagine, like, 'cause at this point, they're basically wearing, like, a potato sack's what it feels like.
Mm-hmm. They're pretty ragged. It says right here that Theodore was so sick he could no longer even sit up in his canoe. Neither, however, could he lay down. Each of the 4 dugouts was packed with men and supplies, and there was not enough empty space in any of them. The former president, had been reduced to painfully balancing on a row of hard-edged metal food canisters that had been covered with a mud-encrusted canvas sheet. The canvas would have been put to better use as a tent to shield Roosevelt from the tropical sun, but the camaradas had no way to rig it up in the tiny dugout. So not only was Roosevelt's pain intense, but he and the doctor both knew that if he did not reach help soon, he would die. In the weeks since, Roosevelt had injured his leg while trying to help free the trapped canoes. Since he had done that, he had developed a potentially deadly bacterial infection which thrives in wet, warm environments. It was the worst kind of combination. When Roosevelt had sliced his leg open on the river boulder, the defensive barrier that the skin forms against outside bacteria had been broken, and there was little that Dr. Kajazira could do to shore it up. The infection had spread rapidly, and by early April, Roosevelt was in grave danger. The skin around his wound had become red, swollen, hot, and hard, and a deep, pus-filled abscess had formed on the soft inner portion of his lower thigh.
Ugh.
His blood pressure had dropped, and his heart rate had risen. His temperature soared, and he lay on his cot, sweating and shaking. It was at times difficult to tell if he was suffering from another attack of malaria or enduring the agonies of his infection.
Oh, could you imagine?
Kajazira hovered over Roosevelt as though he were his mother, taking his temperature, cleaning and bandaging his wound, and injecting him with quinine. But the doctor had almost nothing with which to fight the growing infection. We administered the palliative medication employed in these cases, he wrote. Nevertheless, day by day, his condition worsened, and we started to become seriously concerned. If left untreated or treated inadequately, the infection could lead to blood poisoning and ultimately death. The best defense would have been an antibiotic, but even penicillin, one of the first antibiotics, would not be discovered for another 14 years. Bro.
Dang.
It would not be widely prescribed until World War II.
That's great. Can you imagine a life without penicillin?
No, I'd be dead by now.
I'd be dead.
I'd have been dead by now.
Dead.
Kajazira wanted to operate on Roosevelt's leg, but Roosevelt was reluctant to undergo surgery.
Because he didn't have penicillin.
The Rough Rider was less concerned that the doctor would not be able to give him anesthesia of any kind. He had refused anesthetic. He wasn't worried about that. He had refused anesthetic in earlier leg surgeries. What a boss. Roosevelt was worried that the operation would be performed in an environment teeming with bacteria and disease-carrying insects. Yeah, it would have been, for sure.
Oh, 100%. He would have got hit with some bloat flies, and they'd be squeezing maggots out of his leg.
As was only natural, Colonel Roosevelt asked us to postpone surgery, hoping he would be cured without the need for such intervention, Kajazira wrote. We agreed, clearly explaining, however, that we did not believe in such an outcome.
Could you imagine trying to tell Theodore Roosevelt in the middle of the rainforest, look, bro, you got to let me cut your leg open?
Yeah.
That's not a conversation that's going to go over well.
Yeah. So, that's it for today. We have, I think, one more podcast, Brent, and we wrap this thing up. It's over. It's pretty interesting. This next,
I want to know how they get out. Like, I still don't know the story of how they get out.
No, you don't. And what's interesting, because you find that out next time. But it's not just that he gets out. What happens to him after he gets out? And what are the long-term effects of what happened in those 6 weeks in the jungle to his health and to the crew? Also, what happens in America? Because remember, like, he was one of the most popular presidents in U.S. history. But remember, at the outside of the book, he ends up losing because he splits the vote in the Republican Party, and a Democrat wins instead. So a Democrat wins instead of a Republican for part of that reason, because of what's going on. Anyway, we're going to get to that on the next show. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll catch you on the next episode. Don't forget to use the code GRITTY at Dark Energy, at Mountain Ops, and Gritty Goat at Goat Knives. Thanks for supporting the show. Thanks for supporting us. Stay gritty.